The storm had been relentless, swallowing the ruined city in sheets of cold, pounding rain. Water cascaded from the remains of buildings, slipping through shattered windows and eroding the skeletal remains of a once thriving civilization. Nature had begun reclaiming what was left. Vines coiling through cracks in crumbling stone, trees pushing through streets that had long since lost their names. Karen moved through the ruins like a shadow, his steps careful, deliberate. The smell of damp decay hung heavy in the air, mingling with the distant scent of rust and old fire. He had walked these streets for years, knew them like the back of his scarred hands. He knew where to step, where to avoid. He also knew he wasn't alone. Something had changed in the air. A shift, subtle but undeniable, a stillness that did not belong in a city of ghosts. His grip tightened around his rifle, fingers instinctively brushing against the worn leather strap of the holster at his hip. The weapon was old but reliable, an extension of himself in a world where trust was a death sentence. Karen had learned that lesson long ago. Tonight, he had no plan beyond survival. He had been moving east for weeks, scavenging what he could, avoiding patrols where necessary, hunting when the opportunity arose. But the storm had forced him to take shelter. And now, as he stood before the ruined church, he hesitated. He had passed this place before, a relic of a time when people still believed in things greater than themselves. The stone walls, though cracked and worn, still stood defiantly against time. The stained glass windows, shattered but stubbornly clinging to their frames, whispered stories of gods that no longer listened. The doors had been closed the last time he was here. Now they were open, just slightly, just enough. He moved closer, boots sinking into the wet earth, senses sharpening. He listened, really listened, beyond the rain, beyond the distant echoes of collapsing ruins. There, a flicker of movement inside. His pulse steadied, but his instincts went taut. No one sane sought shelter in places like this. Not unless they were desperate. Karen adjusted the rifle strap across his back and reached for the knife at his belt instead. Guns were loud. Blades were certain. The old wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the storm outside. The air inside was thick, damp, heavy, and warm. Alive. His eyes adjusted quickly to the dim candlelight flickering near the altar. Someone had been here for a while. He could see the makeshift bedding, blankets piled haphazardly in the corner, half-burnt candles melted onto the stone floor, small, carefully stacked supplies that suggested someone planning to stay. And then he saw them. Huddled against the wall was a woman, tall, striking, and undeniably not human. Her skin shimmered in the candlelight, a deep, rich shade of violet, smooth and untouched by scars or blemishes. Her hair, white as untouched snow, cascaded down her back in tangled waves, and pressed against her sides, clinging with small, trembling hands, were two children. They were smaller versions of her, same violet skin, same white hair, but their eyes were wide with exhaustion and fear. The woman tensed the moment she saw him, her arms tightening around the children, body coiled like a predator backed into a corner. Karen didn't move. He had seen fear like this before. It always came just before violence. The little girl, slightly older than her brother, gripped the fabric of her mother's robe. The boy, too young to fully understand, buried his face against her, small fingers curling desperately around her arm. "I'm not here to hurt you," Karen said, keeping his voice even. The woman didn't respond. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her breathing was controlled, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. The girl lifted her head slightly, whispering something in a language Karen didn't understand. The woman responded without breaking eye contact, her voice soft but firm. Then, haltingly, in heavily accented English, she spoke. "Please do not harm." Her voice was raw, heavy with exhaustion. Outside, the wind howled, rattling what remained of the stained glass. The storm was getting worse. Karen's gaze flicked around the room again, the way the blankets were arranged, the small half-eaten rations nearby. They had been here for at least a few days. They weren't just passing through. They were hiding, which meant someone was looking for them. The girl spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. Mama, is he one of them? Karen's stomach turned slightly. Them. He didn't know who the hell they were, but he didn't like the way the little girl's voice trembled when she said it. For the first time, the woman's expression flickered. Uncertainty, recognition, something he couldn't quite place. She exhaled shakily. No, she murmured. Not like them. That single sentence held more weight than Karen understood, but he didn't push. Instead, he glanced at the children again. They looked tired, not just from lack of sleep, but from running. His gaze shifted to the small pack of supplies near the blankets. Not much, some dried food, a half-empty water container, a knife small enough to be concealed in a sleeve. Not enough to last. Karen lowered his knife slightly, though he didn't put it away. If you don't want my help, I'll leave, he said. But if someone's after you, staying here isn't safe. The woman didn't respond. The little boy, however, shifted slightly, peering up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Karen didn't miss the way the girl pulled her brother closer. Mama, he has food, she whispered. The boy perked up. Can we eat? I'm hungry. The mother hesitated, her fingers tightening around her children. Karen sighed. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his pack and pulled out a ration bar. He unwrapped it halfway and took a bite, a universal sign of trust. Then he held it out, not to the woman, but to the boy. The child stared at it, eyes flicking to his mother for permission. The woman was silent, but after a long pause, she gave the smallest of nods. The boy reached out with hesitant fingers and took the food. He sniffed it, then bit into it eagerly. The girl, watching her brother eat, finally looked up at Karen. Are you bad? She asked. Karen hesitated. Sometimes, he admitted. The girl frowned, considering this answer. Then she glanced at her mother. Is he better than them? The woman closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Then at last she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Karen exhaled. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a start. Then from outside, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, measured, getting closer. The woman went rigid. Karen's fingers tightened around his knife. Whoever was hunting them had just found their trail. Karen's body tensed as he reached instinctively for his rifle. He didn't know who they were, but he knew what they were. The kind of men who didn't stop until their prey was either in chains or buried in the dirt. Across the room, Sari was frozen in place, her arms wrapped tightly around her children. Her breathing had gone shallow, nearly silent, the kind of stillness that came from knowing movement meant death. The little girl, sensing the shift in her mother, clutched her arm. Mama, she whispered, barely audible. Sari's grip tightened, her eyes locked onto the door. The boy whimpered, curling into her side. Karen moved fast. In 3 strides, he was next to them, pressing a finger to his lips. Not a sound. His voice was low, steady, but firm enough that even the children seemed to understand. The footsteps slowed, pausing just outside the church doors. For a long, suffocating moment, there was only the sound of rain. Then, the doors began to creak open. Karen acted on instinct. He grabbed Sari's wrist and pulled her behind a fallen pew, pressing them both into the shadows. The children clung to her as she curled around them, shielding them with her body. She was shaking. The first figure stepped inside. The dim candlelight caught the gleam of his armor, dark, polished, and fitted with tech that didn't belong in a place like this. Not human. Karen knew that much immediately. The proportions were too perfect, the movements too smooth. Tarlik. He had heard stories of them before, seen the aftermath of their hunts. They didn't take prisoners. They took subjects. The lead hunter surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping over the abandoned supplies, the flickering candles. He lifted his wrist, tapping a device embedded into his gauntlet. A faint pulse of energy rippled through the air. A scanner. Karen held his breath, pressing lower into the shadows. He glanced at Sari. Her face was pale, her eyes locked on the scanner, unblinking, terrified. The little boy stirred. Karen moved before he could think, clamping a hand gently over the child's mouth. The boy's wide eyes darted to his mother, but she gave the smallest of nods, reassuring him. The Tarlik hunter's device beeped. A sharp, high-pitched sound. Karen's stomach clenched. They knew someone was here. The lead hunter took another step forward. He was tall, his form unervingly precise, like something engineered rather than born. He turned slightly, and beneath his helmet, a cold, mechanical voice spoke. Residual heat signatures detected. 2 adults. 2 smaller life forms. A second hunter entered, his movements eerily synchronized with the first. They are here, he confirmed. Karen felt sorry stiffen. She had to know what would happen if they were caught. The first hunter tapped his gauntlet again, this time speaking into it. Survivors located. Awaiting orders. Karen didn't wait to hear the response. In one swift motion, he grabbed the knife from his belt and launched it. The blade struck the first hunter's throat, right between the armor plates. The Tarlik staggered back, gurgling as he tried to reach for the wound. A direct hit, but not fatal. The second hunter reacted instantly, raising his weapon. Karen lunged, slamming into him before he could fire. They crashed into the pew, splintering the old wood as they struggled. Run, Karen barked. Now! Sari hesitated for only a fraction of a second before pulling the children up and sprinting toward the door. Karen blocked a strike aimed at his ribs, twisting the hunter's arm in a sharp motion. He didn't need to win, he just needed time. A gunshot rang out. Karen ducked, rolling behind a broken altar as the shot ripped through the air where his head had been seconds before. Sari was almost at the entrance when another figure stepped into the doorway. Another hunter. Karen cursed under his breath. They had been surrounded from the start. Sari skidded to a halt, eyes darting between the armored figure and Karen. She was trapped. The little girl clung to her, trembling. Mama. And then, without warning, Sari moved. She thrust her hand forward, and for the first time, Karen saw it, a pulse of shimmering violet energy bursting from her fingertips. It struck the hunter directly in the chest. He was thrown back, slamming into the doorway, so hard the stone cracked. The children gasped. Karen did too. Sari barely glanced at him before grabbing the kids again. Go, she snapped. Karen didn't argue. They ran. Through the storm, through the broken streets, through the city that had long since been abandoned by hope. Karen led them through the alleys, twisting and turning in patterns only he knew. The Tarlik wouldn't be far behind, but he had spent years in these ruins. If anyone could lose them, it was him. Sari's breathing was ragged, but she kept pace. The children were exhausted, but they didn't complain. They just held on. Finally, after what felt like hours, Karen slowed. They had reached an old underground passage, half collapsed but still intact enough to serve as a temporary shelter. He ushered them inside, pressing against the wall to catch his breath. The rain dripped through the cracks above them, the storm still raging. Silence. No footsteps. No pursuit. For now, they were safe. Karen turned to Sari, his chest still heaving. You want to tell me what the hell that was? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled the children close, pressing a hand to their heads. The little boy was barely awake, his small fingers curled into her robe. The girl leaned against her, silent but watching. Finally, Sari met his gaze. Her voice was quiet but firm. They will not stop. Karen wiped rain from his face, exhaling sharply. Yeah, he muttered. I figured that out already. The girl shifted slightly, glancing between them. Are you going to leave us now? She asked. The question made Karen pause. He had survived by keeping his distance, by not getting involved. The second you cared about someone, you gave the world something to use against you. But as he looked at the exhausted woman before him, at the 2 frightened children clinging to her, he knew he wasn't walking away from this. No, he said finally, I'm not leaving. Sari searched his face, as if trying to find the lie. She didn't, and for the first time, her shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in relief. Karen exhaled. He was in this now, whether he wanted to be or not. The underground passage was damp, smelling of wet stone and rusted metal. Water dripped from cracks in the ceiling, creating small, uneven puddles on the cold ground. Karen had led them deep inside, weaving through half-collapsed tunnels and broken support beams until they reached a small alcove where the walls hadn't yet crumbled. The flickering light from his flashlight cast long, shifting shadows, making the space feel even smaller than it was. It wasn't much, but it was safer than out there. Sari sat against the wall, arms wrapped around her children as if she could physically shield them from the world outside. The girl, her wide, violet eyes still filled with fear, leaned into her mother's side, gripping the fabric of her robe. The boy, younger and utterly drained, had finally succumbed to exhaustion, his small body curled against Sari's lap. His tiny fingers twitched in his sleep, as if he were still running in his dreams. Karen crouched a few feet away, unhooking his pack and pulling out a metal flask. He took a slow sip, letting the burn settle in his chest, then held it out to Sari. She hesitated, glancing between the flask and his face, then reached for it cautiously. She sniffed the liquid, checking for poison or something worse, before taking a measured sip. She handed it back without a word. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the slow, shallow breaths of the children, the occasional drip of water, and the muffled storm still raging somewhere above them. Karen was the first to break the silence. "You're not just running from them." Sari's grip on the children tightened slightly, but she didn't answer. "You knew what they were. You knew they'd find us, and you knew exactly how to fight back." Karen's voice was calm, but his gaze was sharp, watching her closely. "You weren't surprised when I said Tarlik." Sari closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering herself, then let out a slow breath. "No," she admitted. "I wasn't." Karen leaned back against the wall, stretching one leg out, keeping the other bent so he could move if he had to. His knife was still within reach. He wasn't entirely sure he wouldn't need it. "Talk," he said, "because I don't take risks for people who keep me in the dark." Sari's fingers brushed through her son's white hair, her touch absent-minded but protective. The little girl, still watching Karen warily, finally broke the silence. "Mama, you have to tell him," she whispered. Her voice was small, uncertain. Sari flinched just barely. She looked down at her daughter, pressing a hand gently to her back. And then, finally, she spoke. "My people," she said, "do not die." Karen's frown deepened. "We do not age. We do not decay. For centuries, we have remained the same." Her voice was even, but there was something beneath it, something heavy. Karen studied her, trying to fit this revelation into the world he knew. "So what, Tarlik are immortal?" "No," Sari murmured. "Not immortal, just unnatural." The girl shifted against her mother, glancing up at her face before whispering, "We weren't supposed to be born." Karen's stomach twisted slightly. "What do you mean?" Sari's gaze dropped to the boy in her lap. She ran her fingers through his hair again, smoothing the strands. "We were made perfect," she said softly. "No sickness, no weakness, no change." Karen exhaled through his nose. He had heard rumors before, stories of civilizations that had tampered with their own biology, tried to cheat death. Most of those stories had ended badly. "So what went wrong?" he asked. Sari swallowed. "Everything." The little girl, still pressed against her side, whispered, "They say love is weakness." Karen stilled. Sari didn't look up. There were no more births. No families. We were manufactured, selected for specific traits. Every Tarlik was given purpose at creation. We were efficient, logical. She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Empty. Karen could hear the pain beneath her words. "You were never supposed to have them," he said quietly. Sari's grip on the children tightened. "No." The girl looked up at Karen, her violet eyes filled with something far too knowing for a child her age. "They called us mistakes." Karen clenched his jaw. The Tarlik weren't just hunting them. They were erasing them. Sari's fingers trembled slightly as she pulled her children closer. "They won't stop," she whispered. "Not until we're gone." Karen let out a slow breath, his thoughts clicking into place. He had assumed this was about control, about reclaiming something the Tarla believed was theirs. But it wasn't. It was about erasure. Sari and her children weren't just fugitives. They were a threat, a crack in the foundation of civilization built on the illusion of perfection. The underground chamber was quiet except for the occasional drip of water from the cracked ceiling and the faint crackle of the fire. The small flame barely pushed back the cold, but it was enough to keep them from freezing in the damp, hollowed-out ruins beneath the city. Karen sat near the fire, methodically cleaning his knife with slow, practiced movements. His rifle lay beside him within reach, the weight of it a familiar reassurance. Across from him, Sari sat with her back against the wall, her long white hair cascading over her shoulders in messy waves. The firelight cast deep shadows along the sharp lines of her violet face, making her look even more distant, more untouchable. Her arms were wrapped around the children. The boy, Sev, was curled against her lap, his tiny fingers twitching in his sleep. His breathing was slow and even too exhausted to be disturbed by the tension in the air. Eileen, the older girl, sat upright beside her mother, her sharp violet eyes locked onto Karen. She was watching him again. Karen let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You're staring, kid." Eileen didn't flinch. "You never told us your name." He arched a brow. "Didn't think you cared." Eileen tilted her head, clearly unimpressed. "You saved us. Mama says we shouldn't trust you, but we have to for now. So I should know your name." Karen smirked slightly. "She's smart. Too smart." He set his knife down and leaned back against the stone wall. "Karen." Eileen narrowed her eyes, as if testing how the name felt on her tongue. "Karen," she repeated. A small huff of amusement left him. "What about you? You got names, or should I just call you kid and smaller kid?" Eileen glanced at Sari, who had remained silent through the exchange. After a long pause, the woman finally spoke. "Eileen," she said quietly, her voice carrying the soft lilt of an accent. She touched the sleeping boy's back. "And this is Sev." Karen's gaze flicked to the boy. "He doesn't talk much." Eileen looked down at her brother, her fingers gripping the fabric of her mother's robe. "He used to." That was all she said. Karen didn't press. He had seen enough broken people to know when a wound was still raw. Instead, he reached into his pack, pulling out a few ration bars and a small metal tin. He tossed one of the bars to Eileen. She caught it easily, but hesitated before unwrapping it. "What is it?" "Food," Karen said dryly. "Not the best, but better than starving." She sniffed it before taking a careful bite. Her nose scrunched slightly, but she kept chewing. Karen chuckled. "Yeah, it's awful, but it won't kill you." Eileen swallowed and glanced at Sari, who still hadn't touched her ration. Karen held out the tin toward her. "Soup. Not much, but warm." Sari hesitated. "Why?" "Because you need it," Karen said simply. She studied him for a long moment before taking the tin, cradling it carefully in her hands as if unsure what to do with the gesture. Eileen broke the silence again. "Why did you save us?" Karen glanced at her. "Because I was there." Eileen frowned. "That's not a reason." He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Because your mother fought back. Because I don't like the people chasing you. Because," he paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "Because I don't like seeing kids hunted like animals." Eileen didn't say anything to that. Sari finally took a sip of the soup, and though her expression remained unreadable, Karen saw the way her shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, the storm still howling somewhere far above. Then Sari spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should leave us." Karen exhaled sharply. "Oh, we're back to that again?" "It's the only way," Sari murmured. "If they catch us, they won't just kill me. They'll take Sev. They'll take Eileen in." Her breath hitched. Karen's expression darkened. "And," Sari closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them again. "They will unmake them." Eileen stiffened beside her mother. The little girl understood what that meant. Karen felt something cold settle in his chest. He had assumed the Tarlok wanted to control them, to bring them back into their system. But this was something worse. He leaned forward slightly. "Unmake them." Sari's fingers curled around Sev's small hand. "Erase them, as if they never existed." Karen's grip on his knife tightened. He had seen plenty of horror in his lifetime. He had done terrible things. But the idea of wiping out a child, not just killing them, but erasing their very existence, made his stomach churn. Eileen looked up at Karen, her voice quiet. "Are you angry?" Karen exhaled slowly. "Yeah." Eileen nodded once, as if that was the answer she had expected. Sari met his gaze across the fire, her violet eyes unreadable. Now do you see why you should leave? Karen held her stare, then shook his head. No, now I see why I won't. Sari flinched, her lips pressing into a thin line. I don't understand you. Karen smirked faintly. You're not the first to say that. Another silence stretched between them, but this time it felt different. Less heavy. Karen stood, stretching his shoulders. I'll take first watch. Sari hesitated. I can. No, you can't. He gestured towards Sev, still curled up against her. You need a rest. You're no use to them if you collapse. Sari opened her mouth to argue, but then, with a frustrated sigh, she relented. Fine. Karen moved toward the tunnel entrance, scanning the darkness. The firelight flickered behind him, sending long, distorted shadows across the stone walls. As he turned back, his gaze met Sari's again. For the first time, she didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him like she was trying to figure him out, like she wasn't sure whether he was her biggest mistake or her last hope. Karen sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. This was getting complicated. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers to push back the chill of the underground passage. Shadows flickered across the stone walls, stretching and twisting with each faint crackle of the dying flames. The storm outside had eased, but the silence it left behind felt just as heavy. Karen sat near the entrance, rifle resting across his lap, fingers absently tapping against the worn metal. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the tunnel. He wasn't expecting an attack, not yet, but he wasn't about to take chances. He had survived too long by assuming that danger was always closer than it seemed. Behind him, Sari shifted. It was a small movement, barely more than the rustle of fabric, but Karen heard it. She wasn't asleep. She hadn't been for hours. You should rest, he said without turning around. A pause. Then softly, I can't. Karen glanced over his shoulder. She was sitting upright, her knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped loosely around them. Her long white hair fell in tangled waves over her shoulders, catching the dim firelight. The exhaustion in her violet eyes was unmistakable. Karen sighed, running a hand through his own hair. He had seen this before, the kind of tired that went deeper than lack of sleep, the kind that sat in your bones, whispering that rest was dangerous because the moment you stopped moving, everything might catch up to you. Thinking about running again? He asked. Sari didn't answer right away. The firelight flickered in her eyes, reflecting something distant, unreadable. Then, finally, she whispered, I should. Karen clenched his jaw. He had expected this. It didn't make it any less frustrating. You really think you'll survive out there alone? He asked, voice quieter now. With 2 kids. Sari let out a slow breath, but it was shaky, like she wasn't sure of her own answer. We survived before you, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Karen scoffed. Yeah? And how's that working out for you? A sharp look from Sari. Her fingers curled slightly, as if resisting the urge to snap back at him. But there was no venom behind her glare, just a deep, aching fear. Karen turned fully toward her, resting his arms on his knees. You don't have to do this alone. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You don't understand, Karen. Then make me understand. She hesitated, the muscles in her jaw tightening. The fire crackled, barely holding on, its warmth struggling against the cold of the underground. If I stay with you, they will find us, she finally said. Karen's gaze didn't waver. They'll find you anyway. Sari flinched. She knew he was right, but that wasn't the part she feared most. And when they do, Karen continued, his voice steady. What's your plan? Fight them off alone? Keep running until the kids collapse. Her breath hitched. If I stay, you will die for us. Karen frowned. Sari's hands trembled slightly as she looked down at the sleeping boy in her lap. Sev. His small fingers twitched in his sleep, brow furrowing as if he could sense his mother's turmoil, even in unconsciousness. I've seen it before, Sari whispered. People who try to help me, they don't last. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, but she forced herself to hold steady. Karen exhaled through his nose. So that's it? You leave before you lose me? Before you get attached? Sari's gaze snapped to his, sharp and wary. This isn't about. Yeah, it is. She tensed. Karen's expression didn't soften. You think if you care about someone, it just makes it worse when they die. So you keep your distance. You leave before they can leave you. He shook his head. But that's not protecting them, sorry. That's just running scared. Sorry's breath hitched, as if he had struck something raw inside her. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, a small voice broke the silence. Mama! Both of them turned at the same time. Seth's eyes were open, groggy, unfocused, but awake. Sorry immediately bent over him, brushing his hair from his face. Sev, she whispered, voice softer than Karen had ever heard it. The boy blinked up at her, then shifted slightly, as if trying to remember where he was. His little hands clutched the fabric of her robe. I had a bad dream, he mumbled. Sorry exhaled, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. It's okay, sweet one. You're safe. Seth's small face scrunched. Is the bad man gone? Karen's stomach twisted. Sorry hesitated, but before she could answer, Eileen, who had been curled silently beside her mother, spoke instead. We're safe right now, she said. Karen helped us. Sev turned his head toward Karen, still sleepy, but watching him now. Karen raised an eyebrow. Yeah, kid, that's me. Sev stared at him for a long moment. Then, in a small voice, he asked, Are you going to leave too? Karen's chest tightened. No, he said firmly. I'm not leaving. Sev blinked again, then, satisfied with the answer, curled back into his mother's side. Sorry swallowed hard, staring down at her son, brushing her fingers over his hair. Karen turned his attention back to her. Now do you see why you should stay? Sorry's expression was unreadable. She stood, stepping away from the fire, her arms wrapping around herself as if she were holding something in. You don't understand, she whispered. Karen stood as well, stepping closer. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way she was looking at him, like she wanted to believe him but didn't know how, made his chest feel too tight. Then make me, he said quietly. Sorry's breath was uneven. I was raised to believe we didn't need love, that we didn't need families, that to be Tarlik was to be beyond such weaknesses. She let out a hollow, bitter laugh. But I was wrong. We were wrong. Karen didn't interrupt. He just listened. I had Eileen, Sorry continued, voice almost fragile. And suddenly, nothing else mattered. But the moment they found out I had given birth naturally, she cut herself off, shaking her head. Karen clenched his fists. They took her, Sorry whispered. And when they gave her back, she couldn't speak anymore. Eileen didn't look away. She knew. She just couldn't say anything. Karen felt something sharp twist in his gut. Sorry inhaled shakily. And Sev, they would have taken him too. If I hadn't run. Karen exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. So that's why she's terrified to stop. She looked at him again, and there was something desperate in her gaze now. Do you see why I can't stay? Karen studied her for a long moment. Then quietly he said, Yeah. Sorry's expression faltered slightly. But I also see why you should. She frowned. Karen, they took Eileen's voice. They would have taken Sev. You think running is going to stop them? Sorry flinched. You don't need to run, Karen said, voice steady. You need to fight. Sorry's breath hitched. For a moment, she almost looked like she believed him. Then, she turned away. Karen exhaled sharply. This woman was going to be the death of him. The underground passage had become stifling, thick with unspoken fears and the weight of the inevitable. Karen could feel it, the tension tightening around them like a noose. Even the children, despite their exhaustion, sat unnaturally still, their wide violet eyes darting between their mother and him, sensing that something was coming. And they were right. Karen had spent enough time being hunted to recognize the shift in the air. It wasn't just paranoia or nerves, it was instinct, the kind that kept a man alive long after he should have been dead. He stood slowly, rolling his shoulders, feeling the dull ache in his muscles. He hadn't slept much, not since they found each other, and now it seemed like that choice had been the right one, because they weren't alone anymore. He turned toward Sorry, who was already watching him, her arms still wrapped protectively around Sev and Eileen. Her expression was unreadable, but she had that same quiet stillness, that readiness to move that only someone who had spent too long running could have. You feel it too. Karen murmured. Sari didn't blink. Yes. Eileen shifted closer to her mother. Sev, who had only just woken fully, sat up and rubbed his eyes. He looked at Karen with confusion before speaking. Is the bad man coming? Karen's grip on his rifle tightened. Not a bad man. Bad men. Bad things. Yeah, kid, he said quietly. They're coming. The wind outside had changed. The tunnels had a way of carrying sound, twisting it, warping it, but Karen knew the difference between an empty night and one filled with movement. Boots. Slow, measured. Too precise to be scavengers. Karen grabbed his pack and swung it over his shoulder. We move now. Sari was already standing, keeping the children close. Where? Karen glanced at the tunnel ahead, then back toward the entrance. If they went deeper into the ruins, they'd be trapped. No exits, no cover. But if they went up toward the abandoned buildings above ground, they had a chance. Up, he said. Sari hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the tunnels. It's too open. It's also our only shot, Karen countered. Eileen grabbed her mother's hand. Mama, I don't want to go back to the dark places. That was it. That was all it took. Sari exhaled sharply and nodded. They moved quickly, Karen leading the way, keeping his steps careful to avoid making unnecessary noise. Sari stayed just behind him, her movements graceful despite the urgency, keeping Eileen and Sev close. The tunnels stretched before them like veins in a corpse, winding and broken. But Karen knew these ruins. He had spent too many nights slinking through forgotten places, hiding from things that wanted him dead. The closer they got to the surface, the stronger the wind became, carrying the scent of rain-soaked metal, damp earth, and something else. Ozone, energy, a charge in the air that didn't belong. They reached the final set of stairs leading up to the street level. Karen pressed his back against the wall, signaling for them to stop. The sounds above were closer now. Then, the hum of machinery. Karen closed his eyes briefly. Damn it. They have a scout drone, he muttered. Sari's breath caught. Eileen squeezed her mother's hand tighter. Sev clung to Sari's leg. Karen shifted, gripping his rifle, mind racing. If they moved now, the drone would spot them. If they waited, the hunters would catch up. Either way, it was bad. He turned to Sari. I need you to trust me. Sari tensed. Karen. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I mean it. No arguing. No hesitating. I tell you to run, you run. I tell you to hide, you hide. Got it? Her jaw clenched, but after a moment, she gave a sharp nod. Karen turned to the kids. Eileen, Sev, stay with your mother. Stay low, stay quiet. Don't stop unless she tells you to. Eileen nodded, her face serious. Sev swallowed hard but nodded too. Karen inhaled, then slowly stepped onto the stairway leading out. The city was too quiet. The kind of quiet that only happened before violence. The drone hovered overhead, sleek and insect-like, its red sensor light sweeping across the ruins. Not a civilian drone, military grade. Karen lifted his rifle, heart hammering. He had one shot before it sounded the alarm. He exhaled and fired. The bullet slammed into the drone's core, sending it spiraling, crashing against the rusted remnants of a vehicle. Sparks scattered across the wet ground. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a high-pitched alarm. Karen's stomach dropped. They knew. He turned back. Go. Now. Sari didn't hesitate this time. She grabbed Sev and Eileen's hands and ran. Karen followed, rifle slung over his shoulder as they sprinted through the ruined streets. The rain had started again, light but cold, soaking into his clothes, turning the ground slick. Behind them, the hunters were coming. The first shot rang out, striking the concrete inches from Sari's foot. She stumbled, but Karen caught her arm, steadying her before pulling her forward. Another shot, closer this time. Karen turned and fired blindly behind them, forcing their pursuers to scatter. Sari ducked behind the remains of an old transport vehicle, pulling the kids with her. Her breath was fast, uneven, but she wasn't panicking. She was waiting, calculating. Karen pressed his back against the rusted metal, glancing at her. You still got that trick up your sleeve? She exhaled sharply. It won't stop them all. Doesn't have to. Karen pulled a small cylindrical object from his pack, a crude but effective homemade explosive. Just need to buy us time. Sari stared at him. You carry bombs? Karen grinned. I like options. The sound of boots pounding against the wet pavement grew louder. Karen pulled the pin, held for 2 seconds, then tossed it. The explosion ripped through the street, sending a shockwave through the ruins. Sari grabbed the kids and ran. Karen was right behind her. The hunters, at least the ones still standing, were disoriented, thrown back by the blast. Not dead, but delayed. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs felt like lead. Finally, they reached an old storage facility on the outskirts of the ruins. Karen shoved the door open, ushering them inside. Sari collapsed against the wall, clutching the children. Karen bolted the door and turned back, breathing hard. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Eileen whispered, "Did we win?" Karen let out a breathless, humorless chuckle. "Not yet, kid." Sev curled against his mother's side, his small voice muffled against her robes. "Mama, I'm scared." Sari pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I know, sweet one. I know." Karen wiped the rain from his face, his hands still shaking slightly. The Tarlik would come again, but they weren't dead yet. And as long as he was breathing, he'd make sure those kids never ended up in their hands. The air inside the abandoned storage facility was thick with the scent of rust, damp wood, and old dust. The only sound was the faint drip of rainwater leaking through cracks in the ceiling. The fire had been put out hours ago. Smoke meant visibility, and they couldn't afford that. Karen sat near the entrance, his rifle resting against his knee, his back pressed against the cold metal wall. His muscles were tight, coiled, ready. Every instinct in him screamed that the Tarlik weren't done. They were coming. Sari sat across from him, her arms wrapped around the children, shielding them as much from the cold as from the fear settling over all of them. She looked exhausted. Dark shadows framed her violet eyes, her face drawn and pale in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Eileen sat beside her mother, her fingers gripping the hem of Sari's robe, while Sev curled against her, his tiny hands tucked beneath his chin. Karen studied them, jaw clenched. They couldn't keep running forever. "We should move," he said quietly. Sari barely lifted her head. "We won't get far in the dark." "They won't care if it's dark," Karen muttered. "They're tracking us." Eileen's head lifted slightly. Her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto Karen, filled with something far too knowing for a child. Sev's voice, small and muffled against Sari's side, broke the silence. "Mama, I don't want to run anymore." Karen's stomach twisted. "Neither do I, kid." Sari smoothed a hand over Sev's hair. "I know, sweet one," she whispered. Karen let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "We have one shot at this," he said. "We make a stand, or we get taken. Those are the only options left." Sari's fingers curled slightly against Sev's back. "We can't fight them." Karen arched a brow. "We?" She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You know what I mean. You took one down before," Karen reminded her. "I saw you." Sari's gaze flickered, but she said nothing. Karen pushed forward. "You said it yourself. The Tarlik don't feel. They don't change. They don't expect anyone to stand up to them." His voice dropped lower, steadier. "That's our advantage." Sari stared at him for a long moment, something flickering in her expression. Doubt, hesitation, something raw and unspoken. Then she let out a slow breath. "If we do this," she said quietly, "we do it right. We set traps. We pick our ground. We don't just fight. We make them regret coming." Karen smirked. "Now you're speaking my language." Sari glanced down at Eileen and Sev, smoothing their hair, murmuring something in her own language. Eileen nodded, pressing her face against her mother's arm. Karen stood, stretching out his limbs. "We've got maybe an hour before they get here. Let's get to work." The first sign of the Tarlik came with the wind. Karen felt it before he heard it. A shift in the air, something unnatural pressing against his skin. Then a low pulsing hum. Drones. He crouched behind the wreckage of an old transport vehicle, gripping his rifle tightly as he scanned the darkness. The night stretched out before him, wet and broken, the skeletal remains of the city looming around them. Then movement. figures emerging from the shadows, tall and inhumanly precise. Their armor was sleek, black and metal, reflecting nothing. Their weapons hummed with restrained energy. They moved in perfect sync, their steps silent despite the wet ground. Tarlik. Cairn tightened his grip on his weapon, steadying his breathing. They stepped forward, scanning the area, their voices mechanical and devoid of emotion. No signs of heat signatures. Possible cloaking interference. Spread out. Cairn's lips twitched. Good. They didn't see them yet. He pressed a hand to the small device at his waist and clicked the trigger. The explosion shattered the night. The first Tarlik went down immediately, thrown backward by the force of the blast. Shrapnel ricocheted through the air, embedding itself into nearby structures. Smoke billowed upward, thick and blinding. Then chaos. Sari moved like lightning. She burst from cover, her hands glowing with energy as she unleashed a force that sent another Tarlik crashing into a wall. The sheer impact cracked the stone behind it. Eileen and Sev stayed where Cairn had told them, hidden, tucked away in a reinforced section of the building, out of sight. Cairn fired 1, 2, 3 shots, each bullet hitting its mark. The Tarlik weren't indestructible, not completely. Their armor could withstand glancing hits, but a direct shot to the joints, to the soft tissue beneath the plating, that they felt. One of the Tarlik lifted a sleek, black weapon and fired. Cairn barely dodged in time, rolling behind a rusted-out transport vehicle as a searing energy blast melted through the metal beside him. Son of a... He barely had time to breathe before a shadow loomed over him. A Tarlik soldier moved too fast, grabbing him by the throat and slamming him against the side of the wreckage. Pain exploded down his spine. He gasped, struggling against the iron grip, his vision darkening at the edges. The Tarlik tilted its head. "You are irrelevant," it stated. Cairn gritted his teeth. "Yeah." He lifted his knee and slammed it into the joint of the Tarlik's armor. The grip loosened just enough. Cairn drove his knife into the exposed gap beneath the Tarlik's jaw. It didn't scream. It simply went still. Then, slowly, its body collapsed to the ground. Cairn stumbled forward, coughing as he wiped blood from his lip. He turned just in time to see Sari falter. One of the Tarlik had recovered, a commander. Sleek armor, taller than the others, its presence crackling with energy. It raised a weapon, aimed directly at Sari's back. Cairn didn't think. He moved. The shot rang out. Sari turned just in time to see Cairn collapse to the ground. Cairn. Her voice was raw, filled with something he hadn't heard from her before. Panic. Pain seared through his side, white-hot and burning. He coughed, tasting blood, but he was still breathing, still alive. Sari turned on the Tarlik. She didn't hesitate. She didn't hold back. She unleashed everything. The ground trembled as energy crackled through the air. The Tarlik staggered backward, armor fracturing beneath the sheer force of Sari's power. Her violet eyes burned with something fierce, something unstoppable. The commander fell. The remaining Tarlik hesitated. Then, without another word, they retreated. Sari was at Cairn's side before he could even process what had happened. "Cairn, stay with me," she whispered, pressing her hands against the wound at his side. His vision swam. His body ached. But somehow he managed to smirk. "See," he rasped. "Told you we could fight." Sari let out a choked, breathless laugh. "Idiot." Eileen and Sev rushed forward, their small hands reaching for him, for their mother. Cairn let out a slow, shaky breath. They had survived. For now. Pain was the first thing Cairn felt. A deep, gnawing ache that pulsed through his ribs with every breath. His body was stiff, his limbs heavy, and the dull throb in his side told him that he had pushed himself too far, again. He cracked his eyes open, blinking against the dim morning light filtering through the cracked ceiling of the storage facility. The room smelled of damp earth, rust, and the lingering traces of smoke from the fire they had long since put out. For a moment, he didn't know if they had one. Then he felt warmth, small hands gripping his fingers. Eileen. She was sitting beside him, silent as always, but watching him closely, her fingers curled lightly around his. Her white hair was tangled, and there were dark circles beneath her violet eyes, but she was unharmed. They were alive. Karen exhaled slowly, the relief sinking into his bones. They had survived. He turned his head slightly and saw Sari kneeling nearby, tending to Sev. The boy was curled against her side, his tiny hands gripping her sleeve. He was still half asleep, mumbling something Karen couldn't quite make out. Sari's posture was tense, but her touch was gentle as she ran her fingers through Sev's hair. She looked exhausted. Her white robes were torn, streaked with blood and dirt, but her expression was unreadable. Karen swallowed, forcing his voice through the dryness in his throat. "So," he rasped, "we're still here." Sari looked up sharply, her violet eyes locking onto his. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to convince herself that he was really awake. "You almost died," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Karen let out a weak chuckle, wincing as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his ribs. "Almost doesn't count." Something flickered in Sari's expression, something like frustration, but not quite anger. More like relief wrapped in disbelief. "You're impossible," she muttered. Karen smirked. "So I've been told." Eileen tugged lightly on his hand, drawing his attention back to her. She was frowning. "You scared us," she signed, her fingers moving quickly. Karen sighed. "Didn't plan on getting shot, kid." Eileen's frown deepened, unimpressed. She released his hand and crossed her arms, tilting her head as if considering whether or not to forgive him. Sev stirred at the sound of voices, blinking blearily before his eyes landed on Karen. His small face lit up. "Karen!" The boy scrambled toward him before Sari could stop him, throwing his arms around Karen's chest. Karen grunted, barely biting back a groan as pain shot through his side. "All right, kid, let's not kill me again." Sev only clung tighter. Karen froze. It was such a small thing, a child's embrace, but something about it made his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted a hand and rested it against Sev's back. "Yeah," he muttered. "I'm all right, kid. I promise." Sari exhaled softly, watching the scene unfold without a word. Eileen, who had remained quiet, finally spoke, or at least she signed. "Are we safe now?" Karen hesitated, glancing towards Sari before answering. "For now," he admitted, "but we should keep moving. The Tarlik don't give up that easily." Sari's fingers tensed at her lap. "I know," she murmured. Karen shifted, testing the stiffness in his limbs. "We need a real plan. Running won't last forever." Sari's eyes darkened. "You think I don't know that?" "I think you've spent too long waiting for someone to tell you what to do next," Karen countered. "That's not an option anymore. We make our own next step." Sari inhaled sharply, ready to argue, but then Eileen touched her arm. The girl's fingers moved carefully, forming words that held more weight than any spoken sentence ever could. "I don't want to run anymore." Sari's breath caught. Sev lifted his head, looking between them. "Me neither," he whispered. "I want a home." Karen watched as Sari's entire body seemed to lock up. This was the moment, the decision she had avoided for so long. Slowly, Sari closed her eyes, exhaling through her nose. She pressed a kiss to the top of Sev's head, then lifted her gaze to meet Karen's. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "Then we find one." Karen's smirk was slow, but it was real. "Glad you finally caught up." Sari shook her head, but this time there was no fear in her eyes, only determination. "Where do we go?" Eileen asked. Karen thought for a moment, glancing at the broken city around them. There weren't many safe places left in this world, but he knew of one. "North," he said. "There's an old resistance stronghold there. They've got food supplies. People who don't ask too many questions." Sari nodded. "Then that's where we go." Karen let out a slow breath, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. "Hope." Sev tugged at his sleeve. "Are you staying with us?" Karen met Sari's gaze. She didn't look away this time. She just nodded. Karen smirked, ruffling Sev's hair. "Yeah, kid, I'm staying." Eileen smiled, and though she didn't speak, Karen understood what it meant. Sari exhaled, shaking her head, but her hand brushed against his, just briefly. It was the first time she had reached for him without fear. Karen pushed himself to his feet, wincing. All right, let's get moving. Sari gathered the children, and together, they stepped out into the cold morning light. For the first time, they weren't running. They were going home. Karen was starting to hate waking up in pain. It had been nearly a week since the final fight with the Tarlik, and though he was alive, he felt like he had been chewed up and spat out by fate itself. His ribs still ached with every breath, his side burned when he moved too fast, and his pride had taken an even worse hit because he had been forced to rest while Sari and the kids handled everything. The small hideout they had found was tucked deep into the ruins of an abandoned outpost, its walls still sturdy enough to keep out the wind, its underground storage rooms offering a secure place to recover. But even safety didn't quiet Karen's instincts. He had spent so long moving, surviving, staying one step ahead of death, that the stillness felt wrong. But this time, something was different. This time, no one was hunting them. Sari had been the first to realize it. A silence stretching too long. No more signs of patrols. No more drones scouring the skies. At first, Karen thought it was a trap. But after days of watching, waiting, tracking movements through the ruins, the truth became clear. The Tarlik weren't coming. Something had changed. And when Karen finally felt strong enough to sit upright, without feeling like his ribs were going to snap, Sari told him why. They're at war, she had said. Not with us. With something else. The Tarlik, so focused, so precise in their pursuit of her and her children, had suddenly redirected their forces elsewhere. A new enemy. A greater threat. Karen didn't know what scared him more. The fact that the Tarlik had abandoned their hunt, or the fact that there was something out there dangerous enough to make them stop. For now, though, it meant one thing. Sari and her children were free. The rain had started again by the time Karen finally managed to get to his feet. He groaned, gripping the stone wall for support, muttering curses under his breath. His body protested, but he was done with lying around. A familiar voice behind him made him stop. You shouldn't be up. Karen turned his head and saw Sari standing in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unimpressed. Yeah, well, he grunted, I'm tired of feeling useless. Sari sighed, stepping toward him. You're not useless, Karen. You sure about that? He smirked. Because last I checked, you were the one keeping me alive. She didn't smile. Instead, she reached out, pressing her palm lightly against his chest, right over the bandages she had carefully wrapped around his ribs. Karen swallowed. Her touch was careful, warm, grounding. You scared them, she murmured. Eileen. Sev. Her violet eyes met his, something unspoken lingering in them. You scared me. Karen's smirk faltered slightly. He didn't know how to answer that. He had spent his whole life not being someone people worried about. Didn't mean to, he muttered. I know. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant patter of rain against the stone. Then Sari did something he didn't expect. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body, close enough that the scent of rain and earth clung to her skin. Karen blinked. Sorry, you almost died for us, she whispered. Karen exhaled. I'd do it again. Her fingers curled slightly against his chest, and for the first time since they met, she didn't look away. You don't have to, she murmured. Karen tilted his head slightly. What are you saying? Sari inhaled slowly. I'm saying, you don't have to fight alone anymore. Karen's breath hitched. For so long, he had been the one convincing her to stop running, the one pushing her to believe that they could build something instead of just surviving. But now, she was the one standing still, offering something real. A choice. A future. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted a hand to his face, her fingers brushing against the rough stubble on his jaw. Karen had been in fights. He had taken lives. He had survived in the harshest corners of a dying world. But this made his heart pound harder than any battle ever had. Sorry, he whispered, and then she kissed him. It was hesitant at first, soft, uncertain, as if she wasn't sure if she had the right to do this. But when Karen moved, when he cupped her face and deepened the kiss, she didn't pull away. She pressed into him, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt, like she was afraid he might disappear. like she was finally allowing herself to believe in something other than fear. Karen wasn't sure how long they stood there, tangled in each other, but when they finally parted, Sari let out a breathless, shaky laugh. "You're impossible," she whispered against his lips. Karen smirked, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "And yet, you're still here." Sari exhaled, resting her forehead against his. "Yes," she murmured. "I am." A sound from the doorway made them turn. Eileen and Sev were standing there, watching them with matching expressions of pure disbelief. Eileen crossed her arms. "Finally." Karen blinked. "Wait, what?" Sev grinned. "Mama, do it again." Sari groaned, burying her face in Karen's chest as if she could disappear. Karen just laughed. A full, real laugh, something he hadn't done in years. For the first time, he wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting for something worth living for. And he wasn't doing it alone. The storm had passed. The world outside was still broken, still dangerous. But as they packed their things, ready to leave, Karen knew it didn't matter. Because this time, they had each other. And together, they were unstoppable. The scent of something warm and rich drifted through the small house, curling through the air like a gentle invitation. It was different from the usual smell of damp stone and stale rations. This was real food. Something warm, comforting, alive. Karen stirred, his body instinctively responding to the unfamiliar but pleasant aroma. His mind was slow to wake, lingering in the haze between sleep and consciousness. Then it hit him. Food. His eyes snapped open. For a brief moment, his instincts screamed danger. He wasn't used to waking up like this, to comfort, to warmth, to the sound of quiet movements instead of distant gunfire. But then he heard soft footsteps, the clatter of a pan, the unmistakable sound of Sari humming. Karen exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face as a slow, disbelieving smile tugged at his lips. This was new, and he liked it. Pushing himself up, he stretched, wincing slightly at the dull ache in his side. He was healing, still sore, still bruised, but alive. And more importantly, alive somewhere that didn't feel like the edge of the world. The house was small but sturdy. They had found it a few days ago, nestled just outside the ruins, a forgotten home, abandoned but untouched by time. The walls were strong, the roof intact, and after clearing out the dust and fixing a few things, it had become theirs. It still felt strange to call it that. A home. Karen swung his legs over the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair before making his way toward the source of the intoxicating smell. The kitchen was a small space, but right now it was alive. Sari stood near the counter, her long white hair tied back, her sleeves rolled up as she carefully stirred something over the fire. Steam curled from a pot, and beside it, there were neatly sliced pieces of fruit, some sort of flatbread warming over the heat. She looked different, softer somehow, more at ease than he had ever seen her. Karen leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms as he watched her. "Didn't know you could cook." Sari glanced over her shoulder, arching an eyebrow. "You thought I lived on rations and desperation?" Karen smirked. Was starting to think so. Sari rolled her eyes, but didn't hide the way her lips twitched in amusement. "Cooking is a skill, one I never had the luxury of using before." She turned back to the pot, stirring carefully. "You should sit. Food is almost ready." Karen pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer. "I could get used to this," he muttered, glancing over the spread. "What is all this?" Sari gave him a sidelong glance. "Breakfast." Karen chuckled. "Yeah, I figured that much. But where'd you get all this?" "We've been gathering," Sari said simply. "There are enough supplies in the area if you know where to look. And I promised Eileen and Sev a real meal." Karen glanced at the small table, where plates were already set. It was such a simple thing, but something about it made his chest tighten. It felt normal, and normal was something he hadn't had in a very long time. Before he could say anything else, a stampede of small feet thundered through the house. Eileen and Sev burst into the kitchen, full of early morning energy. "Mama!" Sev skidded to a stop, eyes widening as he inhaled deeply. "It smells so good." Eileen grinned, hopping onto a chair. "Real food." She glanced at Karen. Bet you thought Mama couldn't cook. Karen held up his hands. Hey, I just said I was surprised. No one said anything about doubt. Sorry smirked, but didn't comment. Sev bounced on his feet. Can we eat now? Please. Sorry shook her head, amused. Sit. The children scrambled into their seats. Karen sat as well, still trying to wrap his head around the fact that this was real. Sorry served them, placing warm bread and fruit onto their plates before ladling steaming portions of stew into bowls. The moment the food hit the table, Sev dug in enthusiastically, making happy sounds as he ate. Karen picked up a piece of the bread, biting into it. His eyes widened slightly. Damn. Sorry arched a brow. That good? Karen smirked. Better than anything I've had in years. Sorry shook her head, but looked pleased. They ate together, talking about nothing and everything at once. The war, the running, the fear, it felt far away now, distant memories instead of looming threats. And for once, there was laughter. After breakfast, Karen found himself pulled into an unexpected battle of a different kind. Sev had challenged him to a game. Eileen had declared herself the referee, and before Karen could fully grasp what was happening, he was caught in a full-on wrestling match with a 6-year-old. Sev, you little. Karen grunted as the boy launched himself at him, attempting to tackle him to the ground. Karen let himself fall, over-dramatically collapsing onto the floor with a loud groan. I'm hit. Sev cackled victoriously, climbing onto his chest. I win. Eileen clapped. Sev, champion of the world. Karen groaned, pretending to be defeated. So this is how it ends, huh? Sev grinned. I'm the strongest. Karen smirked, then, without warning, grabbed Sev and tossed him into the air before catching him. The boy squealed with laughter. Didn't think I'd go down that easy, did you? Karen teased. Sev was breathless from giggling. You're cheating. That's called strategy, kid. Eileen laughed, shaking her head. You're just old. Karen feigned a look of betrayal. All right, that's it. Come here. Eileen yelped and darted away before Karen could grab her, Sev still clinging to his back like a tiny, victorious warrior. Sorry, watching from the doorway, arms crossed, smiled. Not a small, fleeting smile. A real one. Something warm settled in Karen's chest at the sight of it. Later, when the children had finally exhausted themselves, Sorry stepped closer. You're good with them, she murmured. Karen smirked. You sound surprised. She hummed, tilting her head. Not surprised, just grateful. There was something in her voice, something softer than he was used to. Karen hesitated, then reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. Sorry didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, pressing a soft kiss to the corner of his lips. Karen froze. Then, he turned slightly, catching her lips fully with his own. Sorry sighed against him, melting into the kiss, her fingers curling slightly against his chest. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. Karen smirked. You keep doing that, and I might start thinking you like me. Sorry chuckled, a real, warm laugh. I do, she admitted softly. Karen grinned. Good. Outside, the world was still broken. But inside this home, inside this moment, everything was exactly as it should be.